Hello there and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, to AL24 News special coverage. On the 31st of March, Russia has promised a temporary ceasefire to let residents of the besieged port of Mariupol flee on Thursday. Russia's armed forces declared exclusively for humanitarian purposes. However, safe evacuations corridors have functioned only occasionally at best, with Russian and Ukrainian forces blaming each other of sabotaging the escape of civilians. A planned regrouping of troops is taking place in the Kiev and Chernihiv areas. Spokesperson Igor Kushankov said the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, on the other side, said that in a Facebook post, a partial withdrawal of Russian forces from Kiev and Chernihiv regions was underway. To this point, one can say, is Russia withdrawing for good? Or this is another strategy from its forces? And can Ukraine survive another week or even another month? Multiple questions will be answered by our panel of guests, represented by Mr. Helmut Schlenger, Vice Chairman of the Board, Schiller Institute in Germany; Sebastian Perimoni, member of the political party Solidarity et Progress of Jacques Chairman from France; and Julia Rockenford, Assistant Professor from Malaysia. Gentlemen, Madam, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. The discussion begins right after this break. Starting with the latest updates, Pentagon indicates that the number of Russian troops repositioned from the area surrounding Kiev is probably around 20% of the total troops deployed there. Spokesman John Kirby adds that Wagner Group's plans to send about 1,000 of its contractors to the Donbass.
We have seen over the last 24 hours the repositioning of a small percentage of the troops that and the battalion tactical groups that Russia had arrayed against Kyiv, probably in the neighborhood of 20% of what they had, they are beginning to reposition. Some of those troops we assess are repositioning into Belarus. We do think some troops that were arrayed against Chernihiv have also been part of this repositioning. And as well, further to the east, there's a town called Sumy, S-U-M-Y, and we think some of those troops have also repositioned into Belarus.
Mr. Halley has a direct question. How can you explain this Russian withdrawing? Is it a sign of failure, or this is another strategy of its military operation?
You're asking me? Yes.
Yes.
Well, I think, first of all, the Western media has been completely wrong in its assessment of what Russia's military strategy is. We keep hearing about the Russian playbook, but from the beginning, the Russians said they had no intention of taking over all of Ukraine, no intention of regime change in Kiev, and their purpose was demilitarization and denazification. Now, they've already gotten a concession from Zelensky that Ukraine will not seek NATO membership. They've also destroyed a significant amount of the Ukrainian military capability, especially air forces, and they've isolated some of the units, military units. And so now they're pulling back to focus on Donbass, which is the third of their objectives, to ensure the protection of the Russian ethnic majority in Donbass. So I think the portrayal of this as a retreat by Russia, as a defeat by Russia, is part of the arrogance of the Western media and misses the point, which, of course, the Western media has never covered, that there were legitimate security concerns raised by President Putin for a number of years before the special military operations were launched.
Mr. Sebastian, Mr. Halley is saying the Western media arrogant, and in France, they are considered from part of the Western media. In France, how they are considering this military operation, the so-called war by others, taking into consideration that French President Emmanuel Macron have tried several talks with their Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, but nothing appeared to the surface.
Yes. First of all, I want to as it is my premiere on your show, to say thank you for your invitation, and I'm very honored. So from the French part, we are totally submit to the NATO propaganda and the Western media propaganda. So even if Macron, the president of France, is trying to talk with Putin, if we look at the Western media, it's always the Western propaganda around the Putin aggression of Ukraine. And Ukrainian David fighting the big, bear Russia. But the situation we are living in, is not new. Everything has been prepared, by the Anglo-American warmonger. For example, 3 days ago, and I think it is important for your audience to know about that 3 days ago, a report has been published, on a website in the US, Dissident Voice, by Rick Sterling, saying that already in 2019, the Rand Corporation, which is the worst of the warmonger in the US, who have created and launched all the wars since the Bush administration. So the Rand Corporation published a report explicitly saying everything which happened since the last 3 years against Russia. So they say, and the report is called Overextending and Unbalancing Russia. And it's clearly showing how the US will use Ukraine to destabilize Russia and to implement a regime change policy against Putin. And if you read this report that you can find on the internet, the Rand Corporation is already saying in 2019 that first they have the US to reposition bombers within easy striking range of key Russian strategic targets already, deploying additional tactical nuclear weapons to locate in Europe and Asia, increasing US and allied force in the Black Sea.
I'm sorry to cut your train of thought, Mr. Sebastian, but Turkey and France, they are both parts of the NATO. But on the contrary, Putin seems flexible with Erdogan, the Turkish president, more than another one, even Emmanuel Macron. How can you explain this?
But we can explain that Macron, Putin don't want a global war with NATO. That's the question. But NATO, as I was saying, is organizing with the Rand Corporation and all this warmonger think tank an aggression of Russia by pushing troops, making a Defender 2021 exercise with NATO troops around the borders of Ukraine. So France is in the middle of that. And, of course, Macron is maintaining talks with Putin. But as you know, Sarkozy have put France in the commandment of the NATO. So now, even if Macron is speaking to Putin, he's under the commandment of NATO. So that's why he has lost all his credibility. So the first thing to do for Macron, for example, if you want to really talk with Putin and have a real discussion and succeed to have a discussion and stop the conflict, is to get out of this NATO system.
Understood. Mrs. Julia, if you can read between the lines, how can you explain the Russian moving toward Asian countries? In other words, do you think that this military operation in Ukraine will be beneficial to Asia and will destroy European Union?
Well, that's a Napoleonic goal to destroy the European Union. I think European Union has its own dynamics, which is not as much related to the current conflict. However, there are several interesting points which concern Asia. First is that we already noticed that for over a month that the conflict has been ongoing, Asian countries prefer to sit on the fence and to watch, rather just watch what's going to unfold out of it, not really willing to engage. Even you saw some of them voting against Russia in the United Nations General Assembly, but I think there is an idea that it's not going to be very much consequential. At the level of political rhetoric and pretty much of Asia and Western Asia in the Middle East, in South Asia, in subcontinent, in Southeast Asia, where I'm based, except for Singapore, we can say that everyone has been just cautiously watching, taking a very moderate stance. Some are very reluctant at the level of respective governments to call it a war or even an invasion or an aggression, preferring to just first assess what kind of risks for them it might ensue. For example, the possibility of food crisis, disruption of supply chains. And on the other hand, also to see how possibly some of the players could benefit from the ongoing crisis. Because I think in Asia, people, both at the mass level and at the public level and at the governmental level, are not so much preoccupied with the horrors of the war. And I don't think many even watch those horrendous videos of what's being done to, for example, the soldiers, those videos that were circulated a couple of days ago through the Chinese media. So for many in Asia, I guess it's a kind of a spectator sport, and that's why it doesn't hurt feelings as much. So it's easier to take decisions without looking into human security agenda. Besides that, I think many actors, like here in Southeast Asia, are going to look at what China is going to do. You probably have seen some are trying to ponder if China is going to make a move on Taiwan, or if China is going to occupy the South China Sea further. Like, for example, here in Malaysia, we have almost already constant presence of China in the Malaysian EEZ, without Malaysia particularly objecting. And I guess China is going to be the main beneficiary. So the regional actors are looking cautiously at what's going to unfold. On the other hand, or I think we would be able to continue this.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Perfectly, we'll come to this point. China is leader in Asia. Jeremy Fleming, the head of Britain's government communications headquarters spy service, said that Russia miscalculated its operation and that Russian President Vladimir Putin massively misjudged the resistance of Ukrainian people.
Now we're seeing Putin trying to follow through on his plan, but it is failing. And his plan B has been more barbarity against civilians and cities. It's clear that he plays by different moral and legal rules. Far too many Ukrainians and Russians have already lost their lives. And beyond this toll, many, many more have had their lives shattered.
Mr. Halley, coming back to you, based on the British chief's words, do you think that Russia made a mistake by launching this military operation and it could find a better solution, or this is just the word from the enemy to put more pressure over the other side?
Well, first, let me say something about the British. The British are masters of disinformation, and the British role in this is egging on the United States to make sure that Russia and China do not secure a Eurasian integration that could then extend into South Asia, into West Asia, into Africa, and into Europe. And so the attempt to destroy Russia has been the goal from the beginning. And the GCHQ, of course, is a centerpiece of British intelligence, and they're responsible for a lot of this disinformation. Now, on the question of the war, look, war is terrible, and nobody wants to see wars continue. But if you don't want this war to continue, NATO should stop sending weapons and stop encouraging Zelensky to fight to the last Ukrainian. The whole question of being more patient, I mean, Putin in 2007 and 2008 first started raising the issue of security guarantees regarding Ukraine. After the February 2014 coup, it became more urgent. And to me, listening to people like this Fleming from the GCHQ or Anthony Blinken from the State Department in the United States talking about Russian barbarism, Blinken was one of the coordinators of U.S. policy in Syria of arming the so-called moderate rebels with weapons that ended up in the hands of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Blinken was one of the architects of the destruction of the Gaddafi regime and the murder of Gaddafi in Libya. So when they say the U.S. has no regime change policy, that's exactly what it is. So this discussion of the problems with Putin, the Russian army, and so on is mainly to feed the pro-war sentiment in the West. It has little or no effect in Russia.
It's a really strong argument. Mr. Sebastian, as a politician, how can you explain the wars that the British chief, and do you think that Russia could have ended up this operation days ago based on its military capabilities? Why they are taking too much time?
So I want to say that I'm totally agree with what said Mr. Schlenger, that we know today that we have more than 150 British public relation company working with the Kiev regime, to organize the communication of war with the foreign minister. So we know that, and one is very famous, which is the PR network, that say publicly that they are supporting all the Kiev regime for this propaganda against Russia. So that's a point. And I think if we look at the difference between the British and the French, is that, as it was said, the British are, for a long time, think about Tony Blair organizing the war in Iraq with his sexy report. Look at what they did also in Syria with the white helmet organizing false flag operation to destabilize the Bashar al-Assad regime, saying that it was the Bashar al-Assad regime was doing it. So all the time you can find the GHSCQ, this public relation firm, the British MI6 services, running this so-called campaign against all the people who are against their unilateral world vision of the world. So the French is a little bit different, as the president of my political party is always saying, France is a junior partner of the Anglo-American empire. So we are playing a lesser role, and we have to be submitted to this policy. So now we have a problem in France that nobody in France, in the media, in the political area, because that we have a presidential election in 10 days from now, and every time a candidate is saying that he's pro-Russia or supporting a little bit China,
Thank you so much, Sebastian. I have a point to raise in my question considering the political elections. We will come to it. Mrs. Julia, do you agree or disagree with what the gentleman has said? Mr. Haldi said that if NATO wants to stop the war, why they don't stop cutting, giving weapons to Ukraine?
Well, first of all, I'm absolutely sympathetic with everything that the gentleman just shared. I think the current conflict, the ongoing war, and the reactions to it, they exposed a lot of existing double standards, including at the global level, at the level of international system. I think there were some that have been talking for years about, for example, the US involvement into a plethora of conflicts, but it didn't find an understanding ear amongst the public. And when there are attempts, we can see there are more and more attempts to raise this issue now, that why actually, what is so fundamentally wrong with the world that it wasn't reacting for so many conflicts happening in other parts of the world. We're not showing any empathy towards people involved in those conflicts. We're not condemning occurring carpet bombings, and at the same time are so concerned about what Russia is doing in Ukraine at this moment, what is being done. I think that exposes something that is fundamentally wrong with us, both at the level of political decision making and also at the humanity level. And we should ask ourselves why these double standards are applied. As I told you earlier on, many in Asia see it as rather a spectator sport, trying to ride the hype, discussing the conflict, but not really engaging themselves in. As for the question about why Russia did not end the conflict, though it could do it days ago, well, first of all, and that was the strategy, to go in with precision weapons and also try to avoid the death toll among civilians, as well as Ukrainian army, to go as accurately as possible and to have as few victims as possible to this conflict. We should also consider that if we don't consider the empathy part, then at least Russia is definitely trying to avoid a PR disaster, despite still accidental destructions and disruptions that we've been observing. But Russia should achieve its goal in this war. Do you agree? So until it compels both Ukraine and its Western counterparts in what it was initially intending to achieve with this special operation, then it cannot retrieve without losing the face. And it
I appreciated you for this point. Mr. Howley, Mrs. Julia, she is saying that you didn't have the chance to talk before about the Western and media, propaganda, U.S. Conspiracy, but now you are taking Ukraine as part to talk about this. I mean, you are using Ukraine to bring out your rage over U.S.
Well, let me simply say that I'm with the Schiller Institute, and we're mobilizing to have a conference, an international conference, to change the strategic and financial architecture of the present world. What we're talking about with Ukraine is being used as a weapon against Russia, and as I said earlier, against the Russia-China alliance in Eurasia. And by the way, when you bring up the question of Asia, the Indians are very much in the center of this, working with Russia and China. Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, is in Delhi today, and he was in China yesterday meeting with the Chinese foreign minister Wang Yi. There's a different conception that they have from the West, and the financial system in the West is extremely weak. It's crumbling. It's overloaded with debt. And the threat that is represented by a Russia-China alliance, especially now with the Russians starting to talk about using the ruble, the Chinese talking about working a yuan for oil trade with Saudi Arabia, we're seeing a fundamental shift against the unipolar order. And my organization has been calling for an end to this unipolar order, where the so-called rules-based order is determined by those who control the international financial institutions. And if any country steps out of line, especially if it's a smaller country, they get smashed, like Iraq or Libya. Now they're trying to do this to Russia. This is a profound error on behalf of the West. And I think many people in the United States are coming to realize that the US media is not telling them the whole story. To tell you the truth, you get much better picture of what's going on from Algerian television or Pakistani television than you do from CNN or the US media.
Thank you so much. During a visit to Washington, D.C., German Defense Minister Christian Lambert stated that NATO and the EU are even closer than before to Putin. She also pledged to provide weaponry and military equipment to Ukraine, while expressing her skepticism of Russia, who has pledged to dramatically curtail its military activities in direction of Kiev and Chernihiv.
We're closer than we've ever been. We work well together and are loyal partners. Any statements made by Russia and Putin should be viewed with caution, and words must be backed up by actions. It is critical that Russia does not just redeploy forces and search for another means to perpetuate this heinous conflict. As a result, there's a lot of doubt about whether what's been declared will actually materialize.
Well, it seems that Germany is committed to step up in global efforts to support Ukraine in its fight against Russia. Mr. Howley, as a German, don't you think that Germany has already suffered a lot from this operation? Why German officials, they are trying to move forward blindly, to the extent that they are not even thinking about the lives of the Germans?
Well, you make a good point. Look, the suffering is not only people in Ukraine. We're going to see in Germany the possibility of a breakdown of the energy grid, because starting tomorrow or starting today, the Russians are saying they'll only accept rubles for gas and oil. And the Chancellor of Germany, Scholz, said, we're not going to pay in rubles. Now, they may have a few days to work something out, but there are already plans for limiting use of electricity, especially in industry. What happens if German industry can't get the energy that it needs? Similarly, France and Italy have the same kind of problem. So I would say that the Germans are playing their typical role in NATO as a go along to get along. They're more afraid at this point of being a target of the US than they are of the economic damage that will come from their support of NATO against Russia. But I think it's short-sighted. I think many people in German industry, and including in the German population, want to do more trade with Russia and China, and they're being held back by the European Union and NATO. So I think we're going to see a shift in Germany at some point soon, especially when grains disappear from the shelves, when the cost of bread goes up, when vegetable oil disappears, because there's already shortages of vegetable oil at German grocery stores. I couldn't find any corn oil or sunflower oil when I went shopping last week. So it's already hitting, and it's going to be much worse if the Europeans continue this alliance with the British and the US against Russia.
Quite understood. Mr. Sebastian, why France is not doing the same as Germany and kind of as UK? They didn't impose severe sanctions over Russians. Some critics said because France has a presidential election coming ahead, and this will be the turning point to the current president, Emmanuel Macron, that it is well clear in France he is not the next president. People may look for another. So he's playing now his last cards to stay in his position. This is why he is trying to end the war.
Yes, Macron is trying to be the peacemaker. So that's why he's not as hard, as the UK or Germany. But France has an independent way of diplomacy because we have a Gaullist tradition, and you have to know that in the military area, in the intelligence area, you have a lot of people denouncing what NATO is doing against Russia. So you have in France still a kind of a resistance, against NATO policy and against all this propaganda coming from the Anglo-American neoconservative think tank. So that's a point to understand. Then all the candidates are now oppressed to say that Putin is a bad guy and the European Union is a good, and we have to help Ukrainians. So you have a big debate against the candidate to respect, the mainstream media narrative. So that's a very difficult situation, of course, for Macron, because he wants to be the peacemaker, as he is the head of the European Union. Right now, France is the head of the European Union.
And he wants to take the credits of ending the war.
Exactly. He wants to be the peacemaker. But you have a lot of pressure on the French company, even with Macron, because Zelensky has talked to the National Assembly last week, saying that Renault, Leroy Merlin, Auchan, all these biggest companies of France have to remove from Russia. So you have a big pressure coming also from Zelensky and all the NATO group. And I have to say good news, because it is very important that people know that. On Sunday, you have the Sunday newspaper, Le Journal du Dimanche, who published a poll by the IFOP, which is the most important poll institute in France, saying that 52% of the French population is agree with one of the theses of the Russian part. So they don't believe anymore, the Western, even the French media about the conflicts going on in Ukraine. So it's kind of funny because as the Sunday newspaper is saying that the majority of France has become a conspirationist and complotist because they support not the narrative of the EU and the NATO, but support the narrative of Putin. So it's funny that to have this paradox in France saying that almost all the French population now are in complotist.
This is really important.
It's a good news, I think, to not mix the government and the population.
Yes, this is a really strong point. Following the economic sanctions on the Kremlin, Indian authorities are proposing dedicated rupee-ruble payment channels for trade with Russia in order to meet current trade obligations. According to experts, a payment method might pave the way for cheaper oil imports to India, as well as new market prospects for Indian manufacturers or agricultural machinery medicine, furniture, and bathroom fitting, among other things. Mrs. Julia, coming to you in Asia now, precisely in your country, Malaysia, the only country I believe Putin paid a visit to after a month since he launched his military operation in Ukraine, attending organization of Islamic Conference Summit. So, to this point, in Malaysia, is Malaysia taking a side to Russian part?
Unfortunately, I haven't heard of any such foreign visits undertaken by Vladimir Putin. I don't think that he has traveled anywhere so far, but I'm very happy to talk about Malaysia's position on that. Well, by no means I represent the position of the Malaysian government, of course. Malaysia, well, as I told you, except for Singapore in Southeast Asia, all other members of ASEAN, they took this moderate stance. They prefer just to watch and see what's going to happen, how China is going to benefit and what China is going to undertake, and how probably the regional actors could benefit themselves. But most of all, I think just trying to stay away from the conflict that doesn't concern them directly. At the public level, in Malaysia and Indonesia in particular, Indonesia even more, you can see that there is a lot, as well as in other countries and other Asian countries, broader than Southeast Asia even, there is a lot of public support and sympathizers with Vladimir Putin's position in what's going on, and I think they applaud to him to his such a daring stance to challenge the West. I think it sympathizes with many.
Very important.
So
it's very important to say so.
But of course, at the political level, the diplomats, the government of Malaysia should take a more cautious stance. They're trying to. You can see all the discussions happening here in Malaysia. The foreign ministry is not really engaging in them too. There is a lot of work which is done by their Western counterparts, I believe, in order to encourage or pressure Malaysia in order to take some particular stance, which means to join the anti-Russian sanctions, but it simply prefers not to engage until the point that...
Okay. After the Russian media reported that Moscow and Beijing have agreed to expand their cooperation, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said on Wednesday that Moscow and Beijing are paving the way for a fairer world order as he makes his first visit to the main ally.
This is a very serious stage in the history of international relations. I'm convinced that at the end of this stage, the international situation will be much clearer. And that we, together with you and our supporters, will move towards a multipolar, just democratic world order.
Sino-Russian cooperation is limitless. Our search for peace is limitless. Our defense of security is limitless. Our opposition to hegemony is limitless.
Mr. Hawley, how can you explain the Russian wave toward Asian countries, India, Philippines, Malaysia, the giant China? Is Putin, creating an Asian Union such as that one in Europe, taking into consideration that Russia can be an Asian as well as a European country based on its geographical location?
This has been the problem for the advocates of an Anglo-American empire going back to before the Americans were part of the British Empire. The British identified Eurasia as the pivot point in the fight to protect the British Empire. They said there must never be an alliance between Europe and Asia centered around Eurasia. Now, Russia is a country that exists in both Asia and Europe. And the natural alliances, Russia and India have been close for quite a while. The other aspect, as Julia has been pointing out, is that in many of the Asian countries, there's an anti-colonial tradition, or we might say a non-aligned sentiment. And we see that also from Africa. We're seeing that now from Latin America. Argentina is orienting toward China. Brazil is supporting, or at least abstaining from criticizing Russia. So I think what Putin has done is present an idea of breaking the power of the unipolar order the post-Cold War order in which the United States, with Britain in tow and NATO as a military backup, they believe they can dictate to the world what economic policy should be. As you just saw Foreign Minister Lavrov say, that order is over. It's no longer acceptable to most countries, but they never had a fight that they could get behind. Now, with Russia standing up to NATO, with China's support, with the Indians, and I don't know if you know this, but the Indians just told a British delegation over the weekend not to come to India, and instead they had Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, come to India. China and India getting together, well, this is part of this new order, the potential for a new order, but not an exclusionary order. What Putin and Xi are talking about is an international financial order which includes every nation's right to security and right to financial benefit. And I think that's what the Schiller Institute is fighting for. And I think we're actually seeing that emerge. Unfortunately, Ukraine is a victim in this because they're being used to try to undermine Russia.
Thank you so much. I believe a lot of people will agree on that. Mr. Sebastian, briefly, if Putin succeeded in his plans, how this will affect Europe in general and France in particular? And if Russia can create a group of Asian countries, is that going to be the end of the European Union?
Yes, in a sense, but I won't say that I totally agree with what Arley said, because we have an expression in French which says se tirer une balle dans le pied, which means we are shooting ourselves in the feet, you know. And this sanction imperial policy is exactly what he is doing right now. And so it means in the short term, the potential economic disintegration of the European Union. So yes, it's a possibility. But as Arley was saying, you know, already in Germany, they want to cut gas and energy for the industry. So it's totally stupid. And also Macron made a speech, 2 weeks ago, saying that we will suffer. He explicitly says that to the French people. We will suffer because of the sanction. Industry will suffer from it, and the French population will suffer from it. So it's totally a stupid policy, this sanction policy. So, of course, the possible disintegration of the economic system is not only bad for the United States of America, of the European Union, but it's bad for the world. That's why it's very important that we have what the Chinese and the Russians are proposing, to have a world security conference, to discuss the reorganization of the financial system, a new security architectures, and to revive, in a sense, the spirit of the Treaty of Westphalia, which the Treaty of Westphalia, which ended the religious warfare in Europe in the 17th century. So to say, okay, we forgive everything we have done, and now we go all together around the table and discuss this new financial system, this new security architecture for the world, and implement a win-win policy, as China is already doing with the Belt and Road Initiative, for example.
Perfectly understood. I believe there are 2 minutes left. Mrs. Julia, don't you think it is the new world order? What is good for me and for my country, I will take it, whatever the price is. I mean, the prospect of the Asian continent may come over the division of another continent. How can you accept this? Briefly, please.
Well, I don't think that it's going to be based exactly on this principle, to grab things by force. In fact, Russia has advocated for a long time that we already have. Why do we need to even develop this new term of the rules-based order? Well, we already have the rules-based order, which is based on the existing United Nations system, even though it's highly criticized. And indeed, as my colleague just said just now, that the international players need to come up with something new. Of course, and as I said before, the Asian states are practically cheering the effort ushered by Russia into revision of this international order, in particular shifting focus, financial, economic, political focus towards Asia, diversification of financial system, or even there are questions raised about that who international web, the internet belongs to, and how it is regulated. And indeed, it probably is going to give an impetus to new mechanisms, to more diversification. We've already seen the ASEAN countries refusing to get together for ASEAN-US summit. They brought an excuse of the problem with planning, but I don't think that's the real reason, because they don't want to be pressured. The same way that we've seen the Gulf countries actually not willing to increase oil production and supply in order to regulate the market. So I think we are standing on the verge of quite interesting developments, and a lot is going to be happening in the Eastern Hemisphere in that regard.
Understood. Gentlemen, Mr. Haley, Mr. Sebastian, Madam Julia, thank you so much for this fruitful, really important debate. I really do appreciate your presence. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
To this end, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. A special coverage will be held tomorrow also. To this end, have a blessed evening.